That you're here this morning. Do all of you have a copy of the book? Okay, good. So Howard Thurman, who we will be immersing ourselves in his life and work for the next 5 weeks, not only in this time, but also carried over into worship. I'm telling a couple of Howard Thurman stories today. But this book, which was produced in 1949, it was produced almost as a follow-up to an article he wrote entitled "Good News for the Underprivileged." I want you to just think about these two different ways of looking at people groups. Underprivileged over against disinherited. There seems to be a dramatic difference, isn't there, between underprivileged and disinherited. We'll look at why he changed the title as we go on in the next weeks. So it comes out in 1949, and as a result, it reflects language of 1949. So don't be put off by the masculine pronouns or even aspects of a worldview that Thurman represented. You can only live when you do. So we're going to see parts every week of this really incredible documentary on Howard Thurman called Backs Against the Wall. And the title comes from, as you will remember, the very first paragraph that you have memorized of this book, which is, for Thurman, what word, what idea, what concept would be that of the religion of Jesus to speak into folks who have their backs against the wall. And of course, no one has their backs against the wall more than the disinherited. In the prelude to this book, the foreword, Vincent Harding writes this, and near the end of his foreword, it is clear that Thurman's message is now replete with significance for other people as well. Latinos, Native Americans, Southeast Asian, women, and LGBT people are only the most obvious additions to Thurman's community of the wall. What a captivating phrase. Community of the wall. Those who have their backs up against the wall, being oppressed, pushed to the point of near extinction and danger. When you have your backs against a wall, there's nowhere else to turn. There's nowhere else to go. Now or never. What are you going to do? And so that's how he begins the book. That's how he begins the first chapter. And not surprisingly, or maybe it was a surprise to you, he starts with Jesus. And so for Thurman, who is Jesus? He lays it out, in just a few short pages. He does this sort of historical Jesus thing, and he says, he starts with, Jesus was a Jew. What kind of Jew? Poor. A poor Jew. And not only was Jesus Jewish and poor, which already puts him in quasi-minority, he goes a step further to say what about Jesus? And in that context, poor, minority, and misunderstood. In fact, turn, if you will, to page 10 and 11. And that is that Jesus finds himself in the context of Roman authority and Roman occupation of Palestine, and Jesus is going to have a couple of different options given to him, and we'll get at those in a little bit. But I want us to see this chapter because I want you to hear his voice. I want you to see him beyond this picture, and I want you to see where he grew up. He was born 1899, Daytona Beach. He lived in Daytona Beach, Florida, and back to the you can only live when you do, and you live where you are, and he was in Daytona, Florida. Let's see. Everybody take a knee and pray that this works.
Howard Thurman grows up at the beginning of the 1900s in Daytona Beach, Florida.
It was booming. A railroad had just gone through. The citrus groves were operating, and it became known as a place for oranges. It also became a winter community for wealthy Northerners.
In Daytona, blacks and whites are nearly equal in population. And while Daytona could be more racially tolerant than other parts of the South, there is still legal segregation. And each community knows painfully little about the other.
In my kind of Christianity, the ethic, the Christian ethic, was binding on me in relation to other Negroes, other black people. But it had no meaning as far as the white world is concerned. There's just nothing. So that they were not a part of my magnetic field of awareness.
You could go to the beach during the day, you could work there, but at night, you needed to get home.
When you're going through a period where you have the Ku Klux Klan identifying itself as a Christian organization, and a period in which people are leaving congregations on a Sunday morning to participate in lynchings, where you have Christian clergy and laity who are either refusing to say something about the kind of discrimination and the kind of violence that is occurring, or are rather tepid in whatever they have to say.
I knew that when my parents took me downtown that I would sit in the back of the bus. I knew that when we got downtown that if I wanted water, it would be colored water, or if I wanted to go to the bathroom, that I would go to the colored bathroom. I understood the rules, but I also had parents who would say as we sat in the back, because you was having to sit here, does not mean that the people sitting up there are better than you.
Thurman's father worked on the railroad. It's a good job, but took him away often. Yet it provides a home and a respectable living for the family. Thurman's father dies when Howard was 7, leaving behind Howard and his 2 sisters.
His mother, being a primary provider for the home, worked doing laundry for persons in the community, white persons in the community.
But it was Thurman's grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, who has the greatest impact on his life. Born in the 1840s, she spent her first 20 years as a slave on a large Florida plantation. She rarely speaks about those early years, but one story stays with Thurman throughout his life.
She said that when she was a young woman on this plantation, once a year, a minister who was a slave on a neighboring plantation was permitted to have a religious service for the slaves. And always, it didn't matter what his subject was, he ended his sermon in the same way. She said he would stand and look at them and he would say, "You are not slaves, you are not niggers, you are God's children." So we would all wait for that moment because a faraway look would come in our eyes and just a slight stiffening of a spine. And there was a contagion which came to us as little children, that the creator of existence also created me. And therefore, with that sort of backing, I could absorb all the violences of life.
She wanted that to be his primary identity, for him to know that first and foremost, he was a holy child of God, before he learned anything else about himself that people might have said to him as a result of him being a young colored boy in Daytona Beach in the early 1900s.
Thurman describes his childhood as being very lonely. He, I think, always found God in nature. He loved the beach.
I was a very sensitive child who suffered much from the violence of racial conflict. I found that the more I turned to prayer, to what I discovered in later years to be meditation, the more time I spent alone in the woods or on the beach, the freer became my own spirit, and the more realistic became my ambitions to get an education.
In many places, people feel like you experience the presence of God at church. And Howard Thurman did not believe that that was the only place that you could experience God.
Behind their home, a mighty oak tree became the young Thurman's companion.
I discovered that the oak tree and I had a unique relationship. I could sit with my back against its trunk. I could reach down into the quiet places of my spirit, take out my bruises and my joys, and unfold them. I could talk aloud to the oak tree and know that I was understood.
Thurman is talking to trees. Trees!
Florida in the early 1900s provided almost no options for black students after 8th grade. But Thurman is already beginning to excel.
This is part of this early brilliance that one sees, and an incredible work ethic. Brilliance, yes, but a work ethic. So he graduates being the very first African American to complete the 8th grade in Daytona schools. And he goes on to Jacksonville, to the Florida Baptist Academy.
He graduates valedictorian, and as a world war rages in Europe, Thurman writes a personal letter to Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who will later become both president of Howard University and a mentor for Thurman.
There's a piece in this letter that continually inspires me about the life of young people who are committed to service and the importance of mentors who can affirm them. He says, I want to be a minister of the gospel. This is an 18-year-old. I am patriotic. I am willing to fight for democracy, but my friend, Reverend Johnson, my people need me. But he says, please pray for me, because almost on every hand, I am discouraged in my choice of ministry. Sometimes I think nobody cares.
And he's actually asking Mordecai Wyatt Johnson to become his father.
Johnson encourages Thurman to further his studies, and Thurman heads to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Morehouse was founded after the Civil War to educate freed slaves. One of Thurman's classmates is Martin Luther King Sr.
Howard Thurman said that when he walked into Sale Hall Chapel in 1919 as a freshman, President John Hope went to the lectern, and the first thing he said was, "Young gentlemen." Thurman said the words startled the young men because they were not accustomed, as members of the Disinherited community, to being so affirmed, receiving such esteem. And that affirmation, he said, was like pouring iron into their spine.
Thurman was not the most attractive guy in the world. He says this in an unpublished manuscript, so I'm not calling him, I think he's beautiful. But he says his company was not welcomed by the girls, and the guys didn't choose him for the games when they were playing.
At Morehouse, Thurman becomes active in the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, as well as the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where he explores ideas of nonviolence.
It was how could he as a black man survive in a world of hatred and oppression. Pacifism was a spiritual resource for him to give him the strength not to hate these people, not to fear these people, but to deal with them as equals.
Before he leaves Morehouse, he reads every book in the library, again becomes valedictorian, and now sets his sights on ministry at Rochester Theological Seminary in upstate New York. He's one of only 2 black students accepted each year.
I believe Rochester is a place where Thurman begins to be aware of how the Christian faith is more than the way in which a particular denomination gives expression, and to have a vision of who are our sisters and brothers beyond even the Christian family.
While studying at Rochester, Thurman receives invitations to speak in white churches, where he's often monitored by the Ku Klux Klan. But he's also doing something more.
He's traveling through Rochester late at night. He is teaching black maids and male servants the very things that he's learning in the seminary, because he has felt indebted that what he is gaining needs to be available to those who do not have the opportunities to be part of this stimulating experience in which he finds himself.
Thurman completes his work at Rochester, but there's one more piece to his education. Thurman stumbles upon a book by a Quaker mystic, Rufus Jones, and not long after, Thurman leaves for Haverford College, outside Philadelphia, to study under Jones.
It would be impossible to discount Rufus Jones' influence on Howard Thurman. I think the Quaker tradition, not only of honoring silence and solitude and interior experience of the divine, but also the recognition of the inner light in everyone, and also the emphasis on social justice, made that a perfect match for Howard Thurman.
In 1926, Howard Thurman marries Katie Kelly.
Just a young woman who is deeply committed to caring for those who are less fortunate.
In October 1927, their daughter Olive is born. But by 1929, tragedy sets in.
Katie contracted tuberculosis from her work as a social worker.
A year later, Katie dies. Thurman is devastated. He returns to Morehouse College to settle in as a single parent and teacher. In 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, Thurman is teaching at Morehouse College, and the all-women's...
All right. So a couple of things from that. When Thurman speaks of his grandmother, when Thurman speaks of his grandmother, it is with such affection. And of course, the story that you heard is also in the book about that evangelist, that preacher, who would preach to those who were being held as slaves. And the identity piece of you are a beloved child of God. You can't hear that enough. What that's going to do for Thurman, more than any other thing, is it's going to ground him in an interior space that will be with him for the rest of his life, and nothing will shake it. So when a lot of people think about Howard Thurman, they think of Thurman the mystic, the contemplative mystic who really did believe that the power of the inner life was what really gave us peace and could ground us whatever the vicissitudes of life might be. And so you can have there are so many different devotional books around Thurman's concept of the inner life. The impact of Rufus Jones, as we just heard. He would spend all kinds of time in solitude. His number one advice he gave to Martin Luther King Jr., especially after King was an attempted assassination in Harlem, was you need to go and get away and ground yourself in silence. So discipline of silence really did matter to him. And yet, so did social activism. He was not on the front lines of the civil rights movement inasmuch as he was providing a theological and spiritual framework for those who were on the front lines, which is also a very important aspect of the work that is done to secure equal rights, civil rights, human rights. One of the things that I found interesting is that when he went to Morehouse, they said he read every book. In this chapter, chapter 1, I don't know if you read, who all read chapter 1? Okay, all right. Okay, we'll see about that. He describes, I thought this was remarkable, that he would read to his grandmother portions of the scripture, the Psalms, lots of pieces from the Gospels, but didn't read much of the epistles. Acts, yes, but the letters of Paul particularly were troubling. And why? What does his grandmother say to him about not being very drawn to the epistles?
Those were the texts that had been used to justify slavery by the white ministers that spoke to the slaves. Slaves, obey your masters.
Right. And what that means for Thurman at an early age, and of course this happens when he was in college and seminary when she says that to him, but it also reflects and represents that he was doing critical biblical exegesis at an early age, that he was rubbing shoulders with the concept of not everything in the Bible is gospel. That you can preach the gospel, you can preach the Bible without preaching Christ. And so what this means for him is that Jesus, whom Paul, and this gets us really to the heart of chapter 1, that the work of Paul can be troubling because of where and who and how Paul accommodated. So in chapter 1, so look with me right quick. He says that after saying Jesus was a Jew, Jesus was a poor Jew, and Jesus was someone who emerged with a message of an urgency of a radical change in the inner attitude of man, and again, of people, we might say. So, on page 9, Jesus inherited the same traits as countless other Jews of his time. He grew up in the same society, and yet he was Jesus, and the others were not. Meaning, what did other Jews in that time, how did they cope with having their backs against the wall? And he lays out the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Zealots. The Sadducees, in Thurman's understanding and theology, represented a go along to get along, and for safety's sake and for survival's sake, what do? You're a Jew under Roman occupation and you're a Sadducee. What is your relationship to the state? Compliance. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oppressor, oppressed, systems that stay in place. You're seeing, aren't you, the connection to what we have done over the last couple of years here at Binkley and around the globe about white supremacy, white nationalism, etc. So that's one approach. The Pharisees' approach was what? How they accommodated. How did they manage life under Roman occupation, according to Thurman? I thought y'all read that chapter. See, everybody's. Oh yes, teacher. Oh yes, teacher. And then, what is the Pharisees' response in the living of their lives in Palestine under Roman occupation?
They pay the taxes.
Okay,
They
so
pay the taxes and they pay the rulers what they need to pay.
Okay, so they behaved, they obeyed, but underneath that obedience was what? Is what?
There was an attitude of resistance.
Yeah, and
But not an active one, maybe.
right, but also resentment. You know, when you live with 1,000 slights, you end up boiling with a lot of hatred and precision and the keeping of certain things. So it's not like you are on the front lines agitating for change. You're instead boiling underneath. The zealots are ready to take up arms, aren't they? They're ready to get out there and, fight.
That's the real resistance, yes.
It's a real form of resistance that can be a visible response to oppression and violence, and of course that's violence begetting violence, hatred begetting hatred. So 20 and 21, it cannot be denied, at the bottom of 20, it cannot be denied that too often the weight of the Christian movement, he's sketched out, how the Jewish communities have dealt with it, but the weight of the Christian movement has been on the side of the strong and the powerful against the weak and the oppressed, this despite the gospel. In other words, how is it that a formerly oppressed people who have always been on the outside looking in, how is it that you can go from knowing what it means to be, not only in the minority, but to be caricaturized and labeled and misused and abused, to then becoming that same oppressor with traits and characteristics of that which you just experienced? No group, by the way, epitomizes this more than the Baptists, who once really believed in religious liberty and separation of church and state, religious freedom for all people, only to then, no, you Baptists don't. But others do. This is, of course, one of his biggest critiques of the Christian movement in his time, is that it has lost its potency because it has drifted further and further away from the religion of Jesus. So what is the religion of Jesus? If it is not accommodation, if it is not resentment, and if it is not violence, then what is the religion of Jesus? That is ultimately what it comes down to, which gets us back to the first chapter, which says, what is the Christian message for those who have their backs against the wall? And Thurman answers that with what? The kingdom of God is within you. So now think about the two questions that are in the book, in this first chapter, raised by other people. The first question comes when he goes to Burma and India And they want to know, why in the world would black folks in America be so drawn to Christianity, which was the religion of the oppressor? Why in the world would you have anything to do with that? Good question. Which allows Thurman to distinguish between those who have corrupted, perhaps, the message of Jesus into an authoritative set of understandings, which, of course, white supremacy leads the way, over against what did Jesus do? What did he teach? What did he say? Who did he all of those kinds of things. And the second question that is in this first chapter is, he goes to a youth conference and they give the program over to a young Korean girl, and the young Korean girl says, you know, in America, a white boy would say, you know, so what do you want? What do you ultimately want? And the little boy says, what? Candy, goodies, more. But in Korea, we would say we want freedom. So how does Jesus get connected with both of those questions? Which is, of course, why he starts the book with what he, again, it's such a small little book, short chapter, but Jesus and interpretation. So if the kingdom of God is within and is displayed somehow in our lives, what will it manifest? And of course, in the next few weeks, not fear, not deception, not hate, but what? Love. He speaks of the three hounds of hell: fear, hypocrisy, and hatred. In fear, you, of course, are othering. And that othering, of course, divides and keeps you from one another. Hypocrisy and hatred. Hatred, of course, he says at the end of this first chapter, hatred only produces better haters. So the way of Jesus, as I said earlier, is going to be misunderstood, and has, in the history of the Christian movement, Thurman says, been misunderstood. Because a nonviolent life, as represented by Jesus, wasn't a submissive life, wasn't a compliant life, but it was active in a different kind of way. What is that way? And that's where we'll go for the rest of the book. So, since you read chapter 1, find maybe your favorite part of the chapter and just read it aloud to us. Tell us where it is, and then you read it aloud, if you would. We have 10 minutes, by the way, because I have to get out of here at 9:45. Do you have a favorite passage of chapter 1 you want to share? Look at near the end of 24, top and middle of it. But the peace officer gives no protection against the offending Negro. Thus, the Negro feels that he must be prepared at a moment's notice to protect his own life and take the consequences therefore. Such a predicament has made it natural for some of them to use weapons as a defense and to have recourse to premeditated or precipitate violence. I read that and I thought, Trayvon Martin. And. The Talk. Sonny Kelly, the local dramatist, who goes around and dramatizes what it means to have the talk as a black parent with your black child. It is so contemporary. Then further down, deep from within that order, Jesus projected a dream, the logic of which would give to all the needful security. There would be room for all, and no man would be a threat to his brother. Dream, 1949. I have a dream. Others.
Well, one of the things we all do, though, is we rationalize all of this by saying, well, so-and-so is not a real fill in the blanks, right? And I say this, we can say this in so many contexts, that I got to know a number of years ago a Saudi family that were devout Muslims. And their position was that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and all these, they weren't real Muslims. That the Quran teaches us that we don't harm a tree. So how could a real Muslim possibly harm? So all of us rationalize the behavior of others by saying, well, they're not a real, and I say, whatever it is, just to fill in the blanks. So, we have this rhino concept now in politics and whatnot. So we rationalize all of this stuff away, as I guess to sort of make us feel comfortable with how we live with it. And one of the things I appreciated about this, and I always appreciate it when we get into biblical studies and whatnot, and he's not really into biblical studies, but to set what the historical context is and what's going on at the time. And Jan and I were talking as we were coming over, I was struck by Jesus was a Jew, but not all Jews were Jesus. Well, of course not, because Jesus was called for a particular purpose, and the rest of the Jews weren't called for that purpose. And I also thought his distinctions between Paul and Jesus were interesting. The benefits that Paul had by virtue of his Roman citizenship, and one of the things that struck me in there was that if a Roman centurion had thrown Jesus into a ditch,
he's just another Jew in a ditch.
He's just another Jew in a ditch. Whereas if Paul had been thrown into a ditch, he could have appealed that to Caesar. So.
Right. Yes. Yes. That's good. To the first part of what you said, there is this tendency to say, the purest among my tribe would never, and then fill in the blank, right? And of course, Dylan Roof was a Lutheran, confirmed Lutheran. Now, you know and I know great Lutherans. Not all Lutherans are Dylan Roof. But he was a Lutheran. Not all Baptists were part of the KKK in the South, but a good many of the KKKers were Baptist.
Terrorists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th carried a Christian flag.
Right.
And beat police with it.
Yes. And only Pelosi Republicans want to look into it.
One of my favorite quotes this. I have mine on my phone. It's page 410 of his book, but I don't know if that coincides.
Okay.
The heart and soul of the dispossessed, for the spirituality that emerged and focused itself on Jesus and the disinherited, carried an insistent message that life under oppression provided no excuses for avoiding the path of courageousness, courageous creative integrity. Creative integrity, that's what really struck me there.
Yeah, why does that resonate for you?
I mean, it's just like we're always having to reinvent our own selves to the world, and I think that's what Christ was doing. And being in integrity and being manifesting love.
Right.
To them.
Yeah. So for Thurman to take his interpretation of the life of Jesus, the person of Jesus, is to then say, now let's lay that on top of so many other situations where hatred, fear, othering, deception, hypocrisy, let's place that on top of all these other systems that we inherit. And notice the play on the words, inherit. But if you've been disinherited, what has happened to you? You've been written out of the will. It's as if you're dead. And so that brings with it this idea of your back is against the wall and there's nowhere for you to go. So what does Jesus, what does the Christian movement have to offer you? It's a theology from the bottom up, isn't it? I mean, it is a way of living that not just copes with violence and systems of oppression. It doesn't just cope. It tries to ultimately transform it by transforming yourself. And of course, this is what he does. This is what he'll do the rest of his life. He will stay grounded and centered in his identity as a child of God. And he will cultivate that inner life so that whatever occurs, he eulogized Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, and as you saw, Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., was a classmate of his at Morehouse. I do want to make you aware of a couple of brand new books, literally brand new. One is from Greg Ellison, who was featured today, called Anchored in the Current, Discovering Howard Thurman as Educator, Activist, Guide, and Prophet. And then this one, which is written by a historian at Colorado State by the name of Paul Harvey. Not the Paul Harvey, not the deceased Paul Harvey, but Paul Harvey. Howard Thurman and the Disinherited, a religious biography. I want to read just one portion of it to close us out this morning. You heard that he went, of course, to Rochester for seminary. And for a young man deeply immersed in the Baptist tradition, there could be few better places than to go to Rochester Seminary, where he would hear and be under the tutelage of Walter Rauschenbusch, the great Baptist thinker who kind of gave us a theology for the social gospel. Okay. And in the fall of 1923, Thurman came to that institution, and there was an unofficial admissions quota of 2 black students a year, and those students were not to live with white students. But Thurman broke such barriers his entire life. Already a democratic socialist in political thought, he was not likely to follow some petty dormitory rules about racial separation. Soon, Thurman was a roommate with 2 white students and a friend to many others. Thurman's room soon became a sort of intellectual salon, as a classmate later remembered, where Thurman led devotionals and Bible studies, interpreted the scriptures for his colleagues, led them in prayer. In one of these sessions, the classmate remembered, I had the feeling that it was not Howard Thurman, but Jesus Christ. So much did his thinking emulate that of the one he follows. I have never had another experience like that. May it be said over and over, this is someone for our time. And for some, it's discovering or rediscovering him for our times. All right? Cindy, welcome. Jessica, welcome. And welcome to the rest of you. But they are our guests today, and we're really happy that you found your way here. Church in 10 minutes.